So my name is Dr. Amina Douidi. It was mentioned and written everywhere. Today we'll be talking about interculturality in ELT and how we can promote interculturality through cultural diversity. I will start off by deconstructing the concept of cultural diversity with you. Then we will look at ELT textbooks around the world. I've chosen 4 countries where ELT textbooks were analyzed, and we will look at what the research says. Then we will move on to talk about the concepts of intercultural competence and interculturality and how you as a teacher in your specific setting can promote interculturality with your students. So let's get going. If you could, in the chat, please just play along. Tell me if, in the chat below, tell me and write an example about a cultural representation that you have encountered in an English textbook. I'm opening the chat now and looking at your contributions. If you could tell me a topic that you encountered recently, I can see celebrations, food, traditions, so a different, I can see holidays, proverbs, drama. Oh, drama. I haven't seen drama for a long time in course books. Family, superstitions, parades. It's going very fast. Idioms, national events. I'm trying to catch up here. Very good. Food, animals, transport, celebrations, Christmas, family, fashion, sports, etc. Brilliant. This is perfect. So please bear in mind that the people attending here come from different parts of the world, and we're seeing their contributions as we go along. The second task I have for you is if you could write in the chat, please, a recurrent cultural representation that you encounter in your English course books, a theme that comes back very often, if not all the time, a theme that maybe you're tired of, a theme that, yes, festivals, weather, food. Food is always a good one. Emotions, yeah, traveling, community, sightseeing in London, celebrities, nationalities, Christmas and Easter. The weather, again, yes, very good. Jobs, festival, education, food, history. So we can see that there is some kind of trend, yeah? All right, task number 3, if you're ready. If you could write in the chat, please, if there is an example of a theme or a cultural representation that you want to see more often in your materials, but you definitely don't at the moment. So what kind of topics you would like your course book to cover, culturally speaking? Here we go. Philosophy. Oh, that's a good one. We didn't have that earlier. Indigenous cultures. Current events, morals, young people, political wars, history, customs. Yes, which topics you want to see more often? Values, bullying, recent history, languages, astronomy, traditions, values, Ramadan, slang, life of youth, history, psychology. That's a good one. Paintings. Very good. Famous families, social justice, LGBT plus representation, languages, social justice. It came back a couple of times now. Technology, diversity, customs and traditions. Again, very good, very good. Thank you so much. Mindfulness as well. Wow, accent and dialect. This is amazing. These are all the topics that I also would like to see more often. Islamophobia, indigenous representation, indigenous people, teenagers. More parsnips. Yes, very good. Morality, sexual education, progress, films, slangs, stereotypes, deconstruction. Brilliant. Just my kind of people. So we want to challenge the industry, don't we? So let's try to do it one slide at a time. I'm going to share with you. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm moving to my next slide, where I'm going to talk about the cultural diversity in ELT course books. And because my background is in research, and as a researcher, I can't go far if I don't do a literature review. So I've reviewed a few examples here of studies in the context of Indonesia, in India, a contrastive study in China and Germany, and a global course book, and we'll talk more specifically about what the researchers found in each of these settings. So the first study I have here is by Parlindon and colleagues in 2018, and it was about 2 locally published textbooks. When I say locally published textbooks, these are textbooks that were published by national agencies or by national publishers based in Indonesia in this case, and they follow a national curriculum. These course books are for grade 7 and grade 8, and they looked at the different representations of people, places, customs, etc. And what they found is that cultural representations is localized, which means that the representations of the ethnic and cultural diversity of the Indonesian society was carried out through a combination of images, text, and tasks, and it was about the different languages, customs, and varieties and dialects as well in this course book, which was presented as a positive thing. As a celebration of the cultural diversity of Indonesia. So how does this representation look like? It's basically through characters. We have these characters that are Udin, Beni, Edo, Siti, Dayo, and Lina, who represent different ethnic and religious minorities and groups that are based in Indonesia. You can see that they have different skin colors, hair textures, and they also have different outfits, and even their dialogues and interactions in the activities, they again portray this diversity. So, for example, there was a task and an activity about describing a person. So 2 of these characters were describing a person based on their using references to their outfit, and they would make use of the local culture to describe that person. So they would say what kind of outfit they are wearing using the dialect, the slang, the local language. And that was a positive portrayal of the local culture. The next example I'm going to cite here is in the context of India. This one was a very good study that actually I spent a lot of time reading it because I enjoyed it so much. It focused on the analysis and quantitative analysis of 10 locally published course books. And these English course books 2 of them were published by a national agency, and 8 of them were published by state agencies. And each state and regions were quite independent in designing and publishing their own materials. But the idea is to identify a group of books or a corpus, a corpora of course books that would help us make kind of an analysis of the landscape of English language teaching and course books in India. Bose and Gao 2022 analyzed cultural diversity in terms of target culture, in terms of source culture, and in terms of international culture. What they mean by source culture is basically local representations and local references, cultural references. And target culture here is understood as the inner circle, the UK, US, Australia, New Zealand representations, because they are historically linked to the English language. And the international cultural contexts here are basically these countries as settings and personalities and people that are positioned outside of these 2 different places. So outside of India and outside of the inner circle, the historic owners of English, in this case, UK, USA, Australia, etc. So any reference to Germany, for example, would be considered international setting. But they added another layer of analysis here, and it wasn't just about the different cultural products or the different cultural practices such as festivals, as you wrote earlier in the comments. They also analyzed the race, gender, and nationality of the people represented. And they would again position them as being positioned in the source context, target context, and international context. So let's see what the findings say. The findings show dominant presence of references to British, Irish, and North American settings. They also show an overrepresentation of white identities, and in this case, the race that is more visible is white people, and presence of gender bias in favor of male visibility. This one was not really surprising, and it shouldn't be surprising regardless of where we are. Even here in the global north, I am currently in the UK, I come across course books where there is still this tendency to represent men as being at the center of the narrative or as having more power when it comes to roles in different roles in the society. So that's what they found. They found that there is an overrepresentation of white identities, although those course books were published locally by local expertise. And if you try to link this to the Indonesian case study, we had also local course books, but they rather represented the indigenous and ethnic and cultural diversity that is present in Indonesia. In this case, it's different. And what Bose and Gao 2022 say, and they try to explain why there is this tendency, they say that basically because of the historical and immigration context that these regions are in at the moment, and in terms of history of colonization and imperialism, it was expected to see this tendency, the influence in that is there. So, for example, in the Punjabi region, they found that there were more North American representations than British and Irish. Therefore, the North American influence is bigger. And they explained that it is due to the fact that there is a big Punjabi community that recently immigrated and there is a history of immigration of the Punjabi community towards North America, which again explains why there is this overrepresentation. So let's move to the next example that I have here, and it is a contrastive study, as I said, between two course books from China and two course books from Germany, locally published as well. And what they found is that the course books that are published in China, the analysis shows that even though the target cultural information is taking the lead, it means there is a lot of cultural knowledge and references to the UK, US, Australia, and New Zealand. Although there is visibility of these settings, there are some attempts to globalize and localize. And again, we used the term localize earlier in the Indonesian case study, where there is representation of their local culture. And in this case, it's the Chinese diversity that was acknowledged and celebrated. Alongside globalization, and that what is understood here is that there were references to Germany and Norway and Spain, etc. What they noticed as well, and what they found from the analysis, is that although there is the representation of the historical inner circle, which would be the UK and the US, there was also representation of a variety of English use in an international setting and a variety of accents, for example, which helps in itself challenge the concept of the native speaker. And we are talking about intercultural communication here. And what intercultural communication does is create a new model, conceptually speaking, to the learner. So your learners, if they follow a curriculum that adopts an intercultural approach, they're not expected to reach language proficiency at native speaker level. Rather, they are expected to become an intercultural speaker. So being this intercultural speaker is supposed to be the outcome alongside language proficiency that is not guided by any native speaker standard in theory, but rather by the common European framework of reference. And you will see this, your students move from one level, A1, A2, etc., B1, B2, and C1, C2, rather than, oh, they sound like a native speaker. You won't see this in any exam, really, but there is still a culture of the native speaker that we all need to challenge. So in this course books, they claim that there is that kind of challenge, and it is done through the representation of a variety of accents outside of the inner circle. However, what they found is that the activities, the tasks that were provided to the learners were mainly knowledge-based. That means that they were about grammar, fill in the gaps activities, and they focused on language, although the cultural representation was varied. In the case of Germany, what they found is that there is a representation of global topics that they tagged and they flagged as being neutral. So it wasn't specific to a given country, but it was rather global topics such as the environment, animal protection, technology, pet shelters, etc. So these activities were designed to develop intercultural competence. That means that basically the characters or the activity was meant for the learner to be able to travel somewhere and have enough knowledge of a topic like sustainability. So, however, there is a focus on English-speaking countries. So there is predominance of British accents and US American accents, whatever that means. We know that there is a huge diversity within the British accents as well, but that English-speaking country inner circle was very, very visible in the global, in the course books in Germany. And not much representation of the local culture, not much representation of German history or German diversity in the sense of we know how the how Germany has a varied hosts a large variety of ethnicities and nationalities, but we didn't get to see it in these course books, unfortunately. The tasks, though, they were interactive and communicative. They had activities that were task-based, project-based, and they had a lot of discussions and open-ended questions and opportunities for the learners to role play, etc. So if we contrast to the Chinese case study in terms of tasks, it was different. It was very interactive and communicative. So the final course books that I will be reviewing here with you, and I hope that you will go back to my reference list, and I hope that you will check these articles because I enjoyed reading them so much preparing this session. So what you find in this study is that we are analyzing here global course books, and these course books are published by global publishers that distribute their materials across borders and to different markets. Sometimes they get to adopt and adapt these products to the specific market. So they would, we talked about parsnips in the chat before, and parsnips are taboos that some countries won't allow you to talk about, right? So you wouldn't be able to sell your product or your book in those settings if you have these representations in the course books. So those global publishers usually address global topics, so topics that that influence all of us, and they tend to be global in their vision. However, what this study shows is that there is an overrepresentation of the inner circle, and again, native speakerism here is the standard. And that means that there are representations of personalities, of places, of celebrations. You cited Christmas and Easter holidays, things like that you would normally see in the global north setting, although a lot of people in the global south do celebrate Christmas, and Christianity is not central to Europe or North America. Don't get me wrong on that. There is, again, diversity of faith around the world, but you will more often see representation of Christmas, for example, in a context of the US or a UK setting. But again, I am not dismissing any diversity around the world regarding beliefs and faith. So they have investigated the representation of world Englishes and cultures in 3 global language textbooks, and those textbooks are Interchange, English Results, and American English File. What they found is that there is a predominance of the inner circle, but there is also representation of the outer circle. And the outer circle here is a conceptualized space where you would position countries and places and settings where there is a colonial history with the inner circle. So Algeria, for example, is in the expanded circle because we don't have a colonial history with England. However, if we were talking about the spread of French language and francophonie, at the center you would have France and French as an imperial power, and as an outer circle you would have, for example, Algeria as a former colony there, and the expanded circle you would have China and Spain, for example. Yeah. All right. So I want to check the chat below, and I want to know if any one of you here in your context, if you use global course books. So please let me know in the chat if you use global course books. These are course books that are published. So I can see that there is pathways here. Yeah, a lot of people are saying yes. Global Stage, another course book. English File, Interchange, Life Series, Gateway. Very good. Yes, so we have a lot of people here using global course books. So I would like to raise the awareness here about how those cultural representations are positioned. National Geographic, yeah, we had Macmillan as well cited. Brilliant. English World. Yeah, different Global Stage as well. Different publishers, New Headway, Compass. Very good. Very good. Speak Out. Oh, I'm not going to stop now. This is so interesting. Brilliant. So what I'm trying to say here is that be mindful of the kind of representations and which voices are more visible in your course books, which stories are told more often than others. Yeah. Which brings us to our next slide, which is intercultural communication. So now we're going to bridge between cultural diversity and interculturality as a concept that you can achieve and implement and promote in your classrooms. I said earlier that the goal of the current Common European Framework of Reference, for example, and the goal of these course books and curricula are not to make your learners become native-like or achieve a native-like proficiency. The goal is to make them intercultural speakers. So if you could tell me in the chat below, please, what do you understand by interculturality? How do you, give me keywords that align with the idea of interculturality in the chat, please. Yeah? Understanding differences, understanding, multiculturalism, cultural awareness, global understanding, empathy, coexistence, diversity, empathy again, tolerance, finding common ground, tolerance again, international jobs, yes, respecting differences, breaking stereotypes, curiosity, tolerance again, tolerance is a common theme, respect, very good, relationships, excellent. So those are noble values, yeah? So you are a teacher, you have a curriculum to accomplish, there are all these values that you need to promote, and I guess it is quite difficult to do that along with your grammar activity. So what I'm trying to do here is simplify and maybe find ideas. We can find them together on how you can still teach your language and language rules that inculcate and teach those skills and attitude and behaviors. So come back with me. We're going to talk about intercultural competence. The concept of competence here, I would like to invite you to break it down into 3 key concepts, which are skills, attitudes, and behaviors. Once you identify those skills, it's much easier to design an activity to achieve a learning outcome that is related to that skill. And this skill, attitudes and behaviors are needed to improve interactions across differences. So we're not talking here about festivals or cultures in the sense of art and music and big C culture, but we're talking about cultures and cultural differences so that are societal, that are socially constructed. And those differences are in terms of age, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, political affiliation, ethnicity, and so on. So you can see that cultural representations here are focused on representations of identities of people, and those identities are socially constructed. And they include age, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, political affiliation, ethnicity, and so on. Your goal then is to teach your learners those skills or give them the opportunity to develop those skills in order to communicate within their own social group, but also outside of their social group. And this is why we have here across borders. These borders could be local, national, international, or psychological sometimes. So, to sum it up, competence is skills, attitudes, and behaviors. The identities that we will be deconstructing with our learners in terms of diversity are socially constructed. Diversity exists within our own group, and communication is also about communication with people from our own social group. So communication about the self and the world, and communication with the self and with the world. Plus the central point, which is challenging native speakerism through English as lingua franca and world Englishes, but also having as a goal the becoming an intercultural speaker rather than native-like. So how does this look like? It looks like having competencies such as curiosity, interpretation and relating, relativizing, and criticality as learning outcomes. And that would be your job, basically, to design activities where by the end of the lessons, your learners will be able to practice curiosity or develop curiosity about the self, about your own culture, localized, or about the other. And now we're going to talk about globalized, kind of outside of your circle. So the research and question information about the self and the other. And that would look like activities such as going for interviews, taking your students, asking them to interview their family members about a given topic, or interview people who are visiting them from a different region or culture. But then again, we can talk about interviewing and discussing themes that are socially relevant, such as gender roles, not only customs and traditions. Interpreting and relating, again, designing tasks that focus on interpreting and relating, and interpreting a social or a symbol. I was talking to my friend's daughter yesterday, and she was asking me about my daughter's name. So she said, "What's her name?" I told her name. And then the next question was, "What does it mean?" And I tried to explain to her what she means. I was like, "But what do you mean? What does the name mean?" She says, "Oh, my name is Hannah and it means flower. What about your daughter? What is her name?" It was one of those delightful moments where you say, "Oh, she is having to develop the skill of interpreting. And she wants me to interpret for her as well. What does my daughter's name mean?" and she wants to be able to interpret that. So symbolic artifacts like this, so symbolic representations like these could be interpreted in your classrooms, and your job is to find them and challenge your students to do that. This one is hard. Relativizing, relativity, and that would mean normalizing the possibility of change of perspectives, a change of belief, and a change of behavior. And we see this a lot of the time with people, especially young people, developing these principles and these values and say, I stand for this. But then we need, as educators, remind them that people can change their mind. And if somebody believes something at time T, they have the possibility to change that. So this change of narrative and representation is also very important. So, for example, if I take my case as a Muslim, practicing Muslim, I do not wear the hijab, but I know women who wear the hijab, and they are also practicing Muslims. So there is this difference. And I used to wear the hijab, and I changed my mind at some point, and I took it off, and I changed as a person. Maybe I will put it back, and I do put it back when I go for praying, etc. So there is this complexity within the human being that is normal, and we should normalize this possibility of change of perspective, belief, and behavior. So when we take our learners in this journey of thinking relatively, not with fixity about culture, we are helping them develop their intercultural competence. Criticality, which would be the last skill that I will talk about here. There are other skills, of course, so please go check the sources and the references. I can't cover everything here. I'm looking at the chats here, and I really appreciate your comments. Everyone is saying that they agree. People are talking about their own settings. I really appreciate that. So let me wrap it up with criticality so that we can look at concrete examples. Encouraging the learner to challenge the text and uncover ideologies. And this is where you ask them to dig deeper. You can't do that if you don't have time. As a teacher, you have a lot of responsibility, and criticality, sometimes you think, oh, it's going to be a byproduct. They will develop it with time. They are already so critical about everything, especially if you're working with teenagers. But then if you're working with adults and younger learners, you would want to create the space to let this criticality emerge. Yeah. Concretely, what does this mean? Here we go. We're going to take concrete steps towards interculturality. I have this picture, beautiful picture here. If you could, in the chat, please tell me in a typical English course book, what kind of text can you imagine accompanying this image? Or what kind of text, as a teacher, you would want to see accompanying this image? I see Grazia is saying accessibility, technology and innovation, disability, fashion, very good, motivation, technology, inclusivity. Yes, so what kind of topic? Is it like, what kind of image? I just want you to think about it, yeah? And we will get to talk about it more in detail. Technology, human life, empathy, advertising, inclusivity, modern kids, abilities, medicine, inclusion, diversity, appearance is not important. Very good. Tolerance, sympathy. Oh, brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to share with you what this image has been authentically accompanied with as a text. And I would like to use it, for you to use it with your students to think about, and this is a task that I am suggesting here. Please feel free to use it and adapt it as you like. And my prompts here are, which message this picture wants to communicate is a question you can ask your students. Which stereotypes are communicated through this image, and which stereotypes are challenged through this image? I presented this in an earlier session, and one of the comments said, what is the relationship between disability and cultural diversity? So I would like you to think about disability as an identity, for a lot of people, their disability belongs to who they are and how they navigate the world around them. Today, I would also like to invite you to think about the theme of what we as a society make of the disability and how we address disability as a society. So the same way how we address education, or how we address cycling, or how we address recycling as a society, or how we address any theme really as a society, as a cultural behavior. So if you address this topic as a cultural behavior, as us, relativity again, and reflection upon the self, us, how do we treat the theme, and how do we consider and approach disability in our society as the cultural topic, it would be more, it would be easier to address with your learners. Okay, so taking it as a society, addressing disability and approaching it, what kind of stereotypes are communicated through this image, and what kind of stereotypes are challenged through this image? You can discuss this with your learners, and there is no wrong or right answer, and that would help them develop criticality and therefore intercultural competence. So authentically, this image was published on LinkedIn, and the text that was accompanying it, and you can use it, of course, in your materials, just make sure to cite the source. It says, "Mom, Dad, he looks like me. Imagine never seeing someone who looks like you, ever. Admittedly, I've never felt that before, but I do know people who have shared stories like this." So what the author of this post, LinkedIn post, is doing is reflecting and relating to an image, but also saying, I can relate to this image to a certain level, but I will never feel the same because it's not me who is represented, but I know people who might feel this way. And this kind of empathy is a skill that your students would likely develop and articulate along through and articulate through time, especially if they are equipped with the appropriate language that you're perfectly capable to teach them. Yeah, and they're also capable to develop this language. All right, so we're looking at the concept of relativity here and the concept of relating as well. Now there is this picture on the left-hand side of Asma al-Badawi. She's an artist, a poet, and I love her content online. If you could write in the chat, please, what does this image inspire you? What kind of topics you think you can discuss with your students using this image? Women empowerment, Valeria, women rights, women in sports, gender, culture, Sylvia, Tatiana, freedom, Natasha, Bill, women's rights, gender, serenity. Oh, I love that. Serenity, successful women, sports, stereotypes, religion, rights, diversity, women's rights, peace, freedom, cultural identity, richness, culture. Brilliant. I will, you know the drill now. I will share with you the actual text that comes with it. So remember these comments that you're making in the chat. Remember your contributions. Brilliant. So you can use this image with your students and do just as I'm doing with you here. Ask them what it inspires you. You can also ask them which stereotypes it can be communicating and which stereotypes this image could be challenging. Okay? So Asma al-Badawi, I mentioned earlier, is a brilliant community leader. She's an activist. She is a poet and also a basketball player. She's also a brand representative in the field of advertisements. So the text we have here, if you allow me to read it for you super quickly, she says, I grew up avoiding the kitchen. I always felt like I didn't want to be there because it was expected of me as a girl and later as a woman. My mom would urge me to come to the kitchen and watch her cook. She wanted me to learn, but I would run outside to play. It wasn't till I left home that I realized that it was a life skill, one that both my brother and dad also had, and a way to nurture my body and keep up with the daily demands I put on it. So I learned to cook on my own terms. So if you could just in the text, in the chat below, just tell me what kind of dimensions you can see, intercultural dimensions you can see in this text. Freedom, same rights, gender roles, choice. Brilliant, Andrea. Thank you so much. Independence, relatability. Very good, Gracia. Thank you so much. Choice, stereotypes that are challenged here. Multitasking women. Very good. Multiplicity. Yes, there is this complexity. There is no single story here. We have a complex individual with a lot of complex ideas, and she has the right to change her mind. And she did change her mind, but she is not putting herself in a box. Yeah? So she's challenging those stereotypes, but at the same time, she has to eat. So she learned to cook again. Earlier in the session, I used this image again, and somebody in the comments says, I don't understand why this woman is sitting on a stove. And what I'm trying to do here is just say, it is an artistic expression here. These pictures were shared in her profile earlier this morning, and it was a collection of beautiful pictures where she conceptualizes this idea of gender roles and how she grew as a human being. I love Amina Douidi. You should follow her and read her poetry and support her work, etc. Next, and that would be the last example that I have here. This is a picture of a picture that I saw in a bus and I took, maybe with the aim of using it in an event like this one. If you could tell me, what does this image inspire you, and what kind of text can you find or imagine would exist alongside it in an English course book? Kindness, warm generation, yeah, care, joy of life, kindness, love, kind of respect, yeah, health, care, love, family ties, a lot of love and empathy and happiness. And we can see it from the smiles and the flowers and the tenderness as well. Thank you for all those you are bonding time, caring, love and respect. Brilliant. Same thing, you would invite your students to ask, to discuss what kind of discourse or message is being communicated through this image. You will ask them if there are any stereotypes. Again, stereotype not necessarily to the image itself, but also stereotype of our behavior as a society that we keep reproducing in a wrong way, and stereotypes that are challenged through this image. At this stage, I can't think of any stereotype that is challenged through this image. However, the stereotypes that I can say are communicated through it is the representation of elderly, most of the time in a vulnerable situation. And in this case, COVID-19 is in the headline, and the message here is take the vaccine in order to protect the elderly and allow for these moments of tenderness and joy to take place again. So that's the message I think that they are trying to transmit. But again, if you look at your course books after this session, go back and check how are our older people represented in your course books. Are they in situations of challenging health, of caring and baking with the children? Are they active? Are they still working? Are they doing sports? So usually the stereotype is they are taking care of the grandchildren and baking with them, or they are in a poor health and frail and vulnerable. The way we could challenge that is represent our elders in a more dynamic, positive, and more often actually in our course book. So This brings me to my final thoughts. Knowledge of facts about the target culture or any culture is not sufficient to become a competent user of the target language. Intercultural competence is not a natural or automatic result of foreign language teaching. So what we're trying to say here is that exposure to cultural diversity will not automatically make your learners intercultural. What you will need to do is take conscious steps to designing lessons or adapting the ones that you already have in order to address those learning outcomes with intention. And those learning outcomes are curiosity, relativity, relatedness, openness, and criticality. If you don't do it in a conscious way, some students might have the chance to develop their critical skills towards that topic, because life is outside of your classroom is wider and bigger and much more interesting. But then if you want to do it with your students, then you will need to take intentional steps. My final slide says that we can promote interculturality through diverse representation, but it's only the first step. What we need to do is allow representation of complex narratives, and we saw it with the example of Amina Douidi, intercultural learning outcomes, which I just mentioned, and learning-centered activities and pedagogy. If you remember the case of Indonesia, the case of Chinese course books and German course books, some were knowledge-based and others were communicative. And the argument here we're trying to make is that there is more compatibility between communicative activities like role play and open discussions with developing intercultural learning rather than knowledge-based. So fill in the gaps activities won't really do much according to the research out there. Which brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for being with me. These are my references. You will access them through your emails, and you can get in touch on LinkedIn. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Amina. What a talk. What absolutely inspiring and enlightening talk.
Thank you.
This is, I know you haven't done it for this talk, but this talk has been years of hard graphing and research into getting the answers and potential solutions to it. So thanks so much for sharing that.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So we've got a couple of questions, Amina. You got a minute?
I do. Do you?
We do. We haven't got long, but we can do a little bit next.
Okay.
Probably. So one question came up today, and this came up earlier. We didn't have a chance to ask it. Similar sort of question. So this was from Rachel Jordan. So she wants to clarify what you mean by the inner circle countries and the customs and habits that are taught via the English language in the course books. And she was saying that if I was learning Mandarin, I would be quite interested in learning about the culture of China. If I was learning Polish, I'd like to learn about the Polish culture in with the language. So it's all kind of wrapped up in the language a little bit. And they find this actually quite useful when it comes to actually learning the language too. Any response to that?
Yes, thank you, Rachel, for a question. This is a question that comes back a lot. And one dimension that we often forget is the colonial history of English. So China hasn't colonized the world the same way the English did or the French did. And there is this power dimension that is at play here. And without this power dimension, we would be talking about, but I'm going to learn, Mandarin, therefore I expect to learn the culture, etc. So this power and history of colonization has a different play here. If we were talking about German language, for example, and a neighboring country like Turkey, for example, and the relationships that they have historically, so you would expect the languages and cultures that are discussed within the frame of language learning to help you develop that historical relationship, and you would expect to do the same thing with English. The difference is that in terms of numbers, The number of people who use English as an international language is bigger and wider than the number of people who we would historically call native speakers, but we better use the term who are from the inner circle, from the inner circle in this case UK, USA, Australia, etc. Something to bear in mind is that even within the inner circle, and because of the history of immigration, we have people like me who live in the UK you can communicate with. And I also live in the inner circle, and I also bring to this diversity of the inner circle. If you go to London, walk on the streets, you are more likely to find a shopkeeper who is of Indian origin than a shopkeeper who is from Devon or from Kent. So what I'm trying to say here is that the power relationships are different. So the language you're learning, of course, you will be learning about the Queen and the traditions and customs and cultures of the inner circle, but it has to be beyond that. It should not be imposed to us as language learners, because there is a chance that I wouldn't be using idioms of like, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, in any setting really. So I might be using English in a context like the Middle East, where it's rarely raining. So that's what I'm trying to say here, Rachel, that English is particular because of the power inequality historically established with colonization and imperialism.
What an answer. Thank you so much, Amina. Yeah, really valuable history lesson as well, and explaining some of those reasons behind that. Thank you so much.